So we have all of our trees and stuffs put together. You should have created a third-person project. So in here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to third-person blueprints, and you should only have 2 of these. I have 3 because I was testing some stuff earlier. But what you want is the BP third-person character. This is the technical character in the game. When I'm in the game and I hit play, that blueprint is this. It is this player. And you can see when I'm in there, there are settings for, hey, what skeletal mesh do you want? Well, we brought in a skeletal mesh. We called it Bob, SK Bob. It will now look like Bob. Which anim class do you want? Which is technically a blueprint, right? Well, we created one called APB Bob, right? Don't worry about the C it adds. But there we go. Now, if I hit compile and save and play the game, we are now Bob, and you see he's in idle. He is in idle, and as I move, he starts walking and running. As I jump, he jumps. All of that is correct. Now, if this isn't working, you probably missed some step somewhere, and you should rewatch some of those videos. It's easy to get confused on little connections, but that's it. I mean, you literally made the rig, the animations, connected everything, the whole pipeline. It all works. Everything's blending. But we're going to do one last thing, because I really want to show this. I do not want you to be afraid of code because, again, you're not going to make entire games. You could if you wanted to. Anyone can learn that. But you need to be able to test things on your own. If you notice one thing is that this game, it just has 2 speeds. There's walk and nothing. So there's no way to say, hey, the character isn't moving faster, like sprinting, right? So we're going to add that functionality. And to do that, we're going to need to do a couple things. First thing is we're going to need to go into third person and go into inputs, actions, because what we need to do is we need to add an input action for sprint. Now what I'm going to do is right click, go to input, input action, and I will call this IA_sprint. In here, I will open it up, and I'll also open up jump so that you can see. So jump, this is what it looks like. Sprint, this is what it looks like. Very, very few differences. The only thing that we want to do is add a trigger. So if you look at jump's triggers, so you can see what they look like, it's like, hey, pressed and released. Those are the 2 times that I will say an input has changed. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to say pressed and released because that's what I want. I want it when you press sprint, it does something. When you release sprint, it does something else, right? So pressed and released. There we go. The input action is set up. Now we need to tell the mapping to handle that input action because, yeah, we have that, but we haven't said what key on the keyboard it would use, right? So if you go back a folder, it's called IMC_default. It's the input mapping. And you can see right here we have input mapping, and we're going to add another mapping, and we are going to choose our sprint. And then under that, we can click this little keyboard thing and then hit the shift key on our keyboard. And now it will say, hey, when you hit shift, I'm going to execute that input map. And it's when you press and when you release, because that is what you told me to do. So now we've set up the input mapping. The game will actually detect those inputs. It was seriously that easy. But now we're going to go into the character blueprint again, and we're going to mess with this a little bit. If you look at their jump, you can see they have the input action jump, and they're saying started and complete, which is basically pressed and released, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to right click here, and we're going to type IA_ and sprint. So there we go. There's the sprint we created. And if we click this little down arrow, you can see there's a lot of different things, but what we want is started and completed. So now what we need to do is we need to kind of understand, okay, well, when we start and when we stop, I need to change something on the character. What we need to be able to change is technically what's called its maximum velocity. And if you click on the character movement here, which if you're paying attention, you might remember character movement was the thing that we were grabbing in the animation blueprint. We're grabbing this and getting its data. This is the character movement. In here is all the controls on the character. Now, in a real game, if you're working with programmers, you probably don't want to mess with this unless you talk with the programmers. But on your own, you should be able to test stuff. So let's look at this. And let's look for what's called max velocity. And they have all sorts of different max velocities and maximum speeds depending on what's happening. Character movements. We're just going to type max. Look at all these different maxes. Max walk speed, right? So they have one for crouched and just in general. And you can see the maximum is technically 500 centimeters a second. Now, here's the interesting thing. It was 500, and we wanted our sprint to be 600. What we probably want is it to start out at 300, which is what we set as walking, right? We want the character to be like, hey, when the game starts, you're walking. Unless you hit a key, you're walking, right? So we want the max to be 300, which was walking. Now what we're going to do is we're going to drag out the character movement here so that we can access it in code, in blueprints. And we're going to say drag off set max walk speed. And right here, we're going to say 600. And that will happen when we press the sprint key. We'll say, okay, well, now I want you to be able to move at 600. Then we're going to do the same thing again. So we're going to drag off set max walk speed. We're going to set this one to 300. And that's when we're completed, right? So when we release the sprint key, it says, okay, well, then you're walking again. Believe it or not, this is it. You literally just coded your character to be able to walk and run. Now, when we play the game, you see the character is bugged. It definitely is bugged. This happens. You notice I did not type 30,000. I typed 300. This is a common bug that they need to fix. Sometimes this will happen. Like type 300, hit compile and save. You see how it just went to 30,000 again? And then I typed it and it did that. Compile, save. Now it's working. Like just keep typing 300, compile, save. I know it shouldn't do that. Hopefully they fix that bug soon. But that was the problem. Your code is correct. So now I'm walking. Hold on shift, I'm running, and it moved into the other animation. Release shift, I'm walking. There you go. You could do the exact same thing with other input actions. This is why I wanted to bring this up. Let's say you're testing a character where you're like, man, I really want there to be a shoot animation or a punch animation or a twirl animation. You can set up other input actions in your own test environment, and you can very easily change variables and pass them and do all sorts of things. It's technically even possible to save out variables, which you can then access directly within the animation blueprint. That is how all this stuff is done. So hopefully this was really helpful. You've now completely learned the entire process and the proper way to do it. The last thing I want to mention again is that if you are at any point in this pipeline and you notice something is off, it is your duty and your job to mention to the other people, I have noticed a problem. We need to fix it together. Do not continue on if you notice even the slightest problem. Oh, there's a problem with scaling, or there's a problem with any part of it. It needs to be fixed early in the pipeline. And then also just make sure you are doing your own tests. It's extremely common in the industry for you to have a production build, which is like the actual game, and then your own builds, and I said builds, plural, your own games setups on your computer that are local so that you can set things up and mess with them and test them and be like, okay, all my stuff works. Now I can add it to the real game, right? And then the very, very last thing is that's a fine line that you have to be careful about, because you also do need to be putting your stuff in game so that it can be checked by your leads and creative directors and everything like that. So you shouldn't be waiting months, even if you're in an office especially. You shouldn't even wait an entire week necessarily before saying, okay, how do I get this approved? How do I see if everything is okay, right? You need to very rapidly be checking stuff and working on stuff. You should not put in multiple weeks of work without any feedback. That is very, very dangerous and can hurt everyone on your team.